The air in the Dolby Theater is usually thick with ambition, but tonight, it is heavy with something far more ancient: fear. A girl stands center stage, her slight frame nearly swallowed by the shadows, her hands trembling so violently they seem to be vibrating in a different dimension. This is Courtney Hadwin, a 13-year-old walking toward a firing squad of judgment. But as the first note tears from her throat, a raw, jagged howl that sounds less like a song and more like an exorcism, the world fractures. In the judge's chair, Simon Cowell, the man who built an empire on the cold dissection of dreams, does something the cameras weren't prepared for. He breaks. A single, crystalline tear tracks through the armor of his curated persona, shattering the illusion of the Mr. Nasty archetype. How does a child, paralyzed by a social anxiety so profound she can barely speak, possess the power to dismantle the most stoic man in the industry? We are not witnessing a performance. We are witnessing the violent birth of a soul, and the moment the hunter finally felt the heartbeat of the prey. The sky over County Durham does not break. It simply hangs, a heavy shroud of bruised gray that mirrors the perennial quiet of the small terrace house nestled within its valley. Inside, the air carries the scent of damp earth and cooling tea, but the most oppressive element is the silence, a silence that is not empty, but rather bloated with the things Courtney Hadwin cannot say. To the outside world, she is a ghost haunting the corridors of her own life, a girl whose presence is marked only by the soft scuff of a sneaker or the downward tilt of a chin. Within the confines of her mind, however, there is a tempest of Shakespearean proportions. Every simple interaction, a teacher's casual greeting or a peer's inquisitive glance, registers as a psychological assault. The weight of being the quiet girl is an invisible suit of armor, fashioned from lead, that she is forced to wear until her spine bends under the expectation of her own invisibility. Her parents, Paul and Anne-Marie, exist in a state of perpetual, helpless observation. They watch their daughter from the kitchen doorway, their hearts tightening as they witness the agonizing paralysis that takes hold of her whenever the world demands a response. It is a specific kind of parental grief, the realization that their child is trapped behind a wall of thick, impenetrable glass, screaming for connection while her lips remain frozen in a pale line. The house feels smaller on these rainy English afternoons, the walls closing in on a child who feels everything with the intensity of a live wire, but possesses no copper to conduct the current. Her anxiety is not a mere shyness. It is a profound psychological displacement, a fear that if she speaks, the sheer volume of her internal world will shatter the fragile reality everyone else inhabits. Yet, as the sun dips below the horizon and the shadows stretch like reaching fingers across her bedroom floor, a clandestine metamorphosis begins. Courtney retreats to the one sanctuary where the glass box has no power. She clicks a button, and the room is suddenly invaded by the jagged, whiskey-soaked screams of Janis Joplin and the visceral, guttural rhythm of James Brown. In the blue light of her stereo, Courtney's posture shifts. She doesn't just listen to the music. She absorbs it like a starving lungs inhaling pure oxygen. She is studying the architecture of pain, learning how a human voice can be used as a weapon, a shield, and an exorcism. The grit of the blues becomes her dialect. For the first time, she sees a reflection of her own internal chaos in the art of the dead. But the bedroom door is a boundary she has never dared to cross with this new voice. As the calendar pages turn toward the audition for the world's most unforgiving stage, the tension in the house reaches a terminal velocity. The silence is no longer a retreat, it is a predator. The suitcase is packed and the flight to Los Angeles is booked, but as Courtney stares at her reflection in the darkened window, the girl in the glass looks back with a terrifying, mute plea. Will she find the courage to shatter the silence on the world's biggest stage, or will the weight of the spotlight finally swallow her whole? The atmosphere within the Dolby Theater is not one of celebration, but of a clinical, predatory coldness. High above, the industrial lighting rigs hum with a low-frequency buzz that vibrates through the floorboards, matching the frantic rhythm of Courtney Hadwin's heart. Backstage, the corridors are a labyrinth of shadows and frantic energy, a stark contrast to the girl who moves through them like a prisoner walking toward a scaffold. Her father, Paul, walks beside her, his hand a steadying weight on her trembling shoulder. He leans in, his voice a low, desperate anchor of reassurance. But Courtney is beyond the reach of words. To her, the muffled roar of the crowd through the heavy velvet curtains sounds like the crashing of an incoming tide, a vast, auditory wave designed to pull her under. She is not a performer preparing for a debut. She is a child facing an existential erasure, her lungs constricted by the sheer gravity of the moment. The perspective shifts to the judges' table, a fortress of ivory and chrome where Simon Cowell sits with the weary grace of a monarch who has seen it all. Beside him, the air is thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the electric hum of television production. Simon's eyes are narrowed, hooded by decades of wading through the artificial and the mundane. He has witnessed 10,000 auditions, processed 1,000,000 manufactured smiles, and heard every rehearsed sob story the industry could produce. He is waiting for a reason to care, his soul calloused by the repetitive theater of ambition. To him, the next act is likely just another polished, stage-managed child, a puppet of parental dreams, and he prepares his mind for the polite, practiced dismissal that has become his professional signature. Then, the curtain parts. The girl who walks onto the stage is a haunting sight. Courtney appears physically diminished by the vastness of the arena, her slight frame hunched as if trying to fold herself into a smaller, safer dimension. The audience, usually primed for mindless applause, falls into a confused, uncomfortable hush. They are not seeing a star. They are witnessing a psychological collapse in real time. Courtney's knees knock together with a visible, rhythmic violence, and her hands flutter at her sides like wounded birds. The silence that follows is not the silence of anticipation, but the silence of a car crash about to happen. Mel B, leaning forward with a mix of pity and concern, tries to coax a single syllable from the girl's throat. She offers a gentle question, a lifeline thrown into deep water, but Courtney only manages a strained, breathless whisper that dies before it can reach the microphones. She is drowning in the open air. The judges exchange glances, sidelong looks of tragic realization. The narrative tension becomes a physical weight, an unbearable pressure that makes the air in the theater feel stagnant and depleted of oxygen. To the viewers at home and the thousands in the seats, the failure feels etched into the very geometry of her posture. The quiet girl from Durham has finally been backed into the ultimate corner, and the walls are beginning to crumble inward. Every second that passes without a note being sung feels like a minute of mourning for a dream that is dying before it can even breathe. The spectacle has turned from a talent show into a slow-motion tragedy of human fragility. Simon Cowell's patience finally reaches its threshold. His expression hardens into a mask of clinical finality as he leans forward, his hand moving with slow, deliberate intent toward the cold plastic of the red buzzer, entirely unaware that he is a heartbeat away from the most profound and violent shock of his professional life. The first note of the backing track hits the room like a physical blow, a gritty, distortion-heavy vintage soul riff that feels entirely at odds with the fragile figure center stage. But as the sound waves connect with Courtney Hadwin's body, the girl who could not speak simply ceases to exist. In a fraction of a second, the stuttering child from County Durham is replaced by a banshee, a whirlwind of flailing limbs and jagged, electric movement. When she opens her mouth, it is not a song that emerges, but a volcanic eruption of sound that seems to have been forged in the smoky, desperate basement clubs of 1960s Memphis. It is a voice that carries the weight of 1,000 years of blues, a raspy, guttural howl that tears through the clinical atmosphere of the Dolby Theater, shattering the artifice of the television production. For Courtney, this is not a performance. It is a violent, psychological exorcism. Each scream is a release valve for every repressed emotion, every hour spent in the suffocating shadow of the quiet girl label, and every silent tear she ever shed in the isolation of her bedroom. She is no longer dancing. She is convulsing under the power of a spirit that has finally found its dialect. The flailing of her arms, which minutes ago looked like the tremors of a victim, now look like the strikes of a fighter. She is reclaiming her identity in real time, using the stage as a sanctuary where her internal tempest can finally be externalized. The audience's reaction is caught in a collective mask of visceral shock. People are rising from their seats not out of habit, but out of a primal reflex, as if drawn to a fire they didn't see coming. We focus then on Simon Cowell, and the transformation is even more profound. The cameras zoom in, capturing the exact micro-expression where his professional cynicism is executed. His jaw, usually set in a firm line of boredom, slackens. His eyes, which have spent decades scanning for the marketable and the manufactured, widen with a look of genuine, terrifying awe. In Courtney, he recognizes the one thing he had almost forgotten existed: raw, uncurated talent that defies every rule of the industry he helped build. She is the antithesis of the pop star mold. She is messy, unpredictable, and dangerously authentic. It is a moment of spiritual bypass. The sound doesn't travel through his ears to be analyzed. It hits his spirit with the force of a high-speed collision. He is looking at a girl who has bypassed the brain entirely to speak directly to the soul of the room. The air in the theater is now thick with the scent of ozone and the heat of thousands of bodies in motion. The music reaches a crescendo, a final, jagged peak of soul-searching intensity that leaves Courtney gasping for air, her hair matted to her forehead, her body vibrating with the aftershocks of the release. The silence that follows the final note lasts only a millisecond before the crowd erupts into a physical force of sound, a standing ovation that feels more like a riot of appreciation. As the roar of the audience becomes a deafening tide, Simon Cowell remains frozen in his chair, his gaze fixed on the girl who just dismantled his world, until he slowly reaches up to his face, his fingers trembling as they touch a dampness he didn't authorize, shocked to find that his own eyes have completely betrayed his legendary, ice-cold composure. The gold confetti had barely settled on the stage before the weight of the world began to press against Courtney's chest. In the cinematic language of fame, the golden buzzer is a crowning achievement, but in the psychological reality of a 13-year-old girl, it was the construction of a new, more terrifying glass box. The quiet girl from Durham had been replaced by a global phenomenon, a viral sensation whose face was now plastered across digital screens from London to Tokyo. But success, as she soon discovered, is merely a different kind of trauma. The world did not just want to hear her sing. It wanted to own her narrative, demanding she remain frozen in that singular moment of shy vulnerability, even as the gears of the industry began to grind her spirit into a marketable product. As she moved from the sterile quiet of her bedroom to the frantic, neon-lit streets of Los Angeles, a deep, resonant loneliness took root. We see Courtney in the back of sleek black SUVs, her face illuminated by the cold, blue light of a smartphone as she scrolls through the digital afterlife of her performance. The internet, in its casual cruelty, began to dissect the very things that had saved her. Trolls mocked her eccentric movements, labeling her flailing limbs as theatrical or fake, unaware that they were mocking the symptoms of her survival. The psychological toll was immense. The stage had been the only place she felt free, but now, even that sanctuary was being invaded by the judgment of millions. The pressure to replicate the miracle of her first audition became a suffocating shroud, making every subsequent breath feel like a performance for an invisible jury. In the middle of this burgeoning darkness stood Simon Cowell, a man undergoing a quiet, internal revolution. He found himself no longer acting as a judge, but as a guardian. Having spent a lifetime polishing the jagged edges off artists to make them shine for the masses, he now felt a fierce, protective instinct to keep Courtney's edges exactly as they were. He saw the flicker of fear in her eyes during rehearsals, the way her shoulders began to hunch again under the weight of expectation. Simon was navigating his own emotional awakening, realizing that in protecting Courtney's raw authenticity, he was attempting to salvage a piece of his own humanity that the industry had long ago tried to bury. The atmosphere of this period is one of high-contrast isolation, bright flashes of paparazzi bulbs followed by the deafening silence of hotel rooms where the air feels too thin to breathe. Courtney realized with a sickening clarity that the world which had celebrated her voice was now trying to steal the soul behind it, attempting to domesticate the banshee. Yet, as she stood at the precipice of the grand finale, with the eyes of the planet fixed upon her, a devastating personal realization began to take hold. A crushing sense of doubt that whispered a terrifying question. What if the voice that set her free was now the very thing that would keep her prisoner forever? The final movement of this journey does not conclude with a triumphant roar, but with a resonant, soulful hum, the sound of a girl who has finally learned to inhabit her own skin. We see Courtney now, years removed from the blinding glare of that first gold-dusted stage, standing in the soft, amber light of a recording studio. She is no longer just a contestant trapped in a viral loop. She is a woman who has brokered a peace treaty with her own psyche. The social anxiety that once paralyzed her has not vanished, but it has been reframed. She has accepted the profound psychological truth that her greatest wound and her greatest power are two sides of a single, shimmering coin. The trembling hands that once signaled a collapse are now the very instruments that channel the electricity of her art. She has learned that to be different is not a sentence of isolation, but a mandate for authenticity in a world that breeds carbon copies. The narrative lens pulls back to find Simon Cowell, seated in a quiet room, away from the clamor of the cameras. The reflection in his eyes is different now, softer, perhaps, or simply more grounded. Courtney Hadwin was the earthquake that cracked the foundation of his industry-hardened heart. Through her, he underwent a silent revolution, moving away from the pursuit of the perfectly manufactured and toward the viscerally real. He no longer looks for voices that fit the radio. He looks for souls that break the frequency. This girl from County Durham did more than win a competition. She performed a quiet miracle on the man who thought he had seen everything, reminding a jaded architect of dreams how to actually feel the weight of a moment. As the sun sets over the rugged hills of her northern home, the atmosphere is one of profound, poetic resilience. The suffocating silence of the terrace house has been replaced by a low, constant vibration of purpose. Courtney has proven that the quiet girl was never empty. She was simply waiting for the world to learn her language. The legacy of that single, tearful encounter remains etched in the history of the stage, not as a victory of talent over fear, but as a union of the two. We are left with the image of an artist who no longer hides behind the music, but uses it as a bridge to a world she once feared to touch. But as the studio lights dim and the final echoes of the session fade into the dark, one final, whispered truth from Courtney lingers in the air, leaving us to wonder, was the stage truly her salvation, or has she simply found the world's most beautiful hiding place?